I hope for this little 15 minutes that I have here that I'm going to first horrify you and then give you some hope. So,
thanks for listening. Yeah.
When I first started doing programs on gas drilling, I had these great photos of out west. Josh has a lot of those in his film. And I had people saying, well, that can't happen here. There's too many trees. Oh, that's not going to happen here. There's mountains. And this is Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania before gas drilling. And the next slide is Allegheny National Forest after gas drilling. This is, to be accurate here, this is not gas, I said after gas drilling. These are actually oil wells, but these are the same spacing unit sizes that exist with what's legal in New York State. These are 40-acre spacing units. Now, when I say a spacing unit, that's the square that the company draws on the map, makes their application and says, we're going to put a well pad here and drill 6, 5, or 10 wells out to cover this area. And this is where we're taking the gas from. The way the law is in New York, it encourages larger units to begin with, but the history of shale gas across the United States, they start out with big spacing units. They may do some vertical wells for exploratory purposes, but then they downspace. And in some places, in Fort Worth, they're down to 20-acre spacing units. But here, we're talking about 40 acres in the state of New York. The gas industry has these hazardous wastes that under the EPA they can't regulate it as hazardous waste, and it can only be regulated as industrial waste. So you have a situation where trucks are coming to a site, injecting hazardous waste into the ground, mixing it with other hazardous elements, bringing it back up, and then it becomes industrial waste. It's not hazardous waste anymore because somebody wrote it that way. So what are we talking about? Surfactants, friction-reducing chemicals, biocides, scale inhibitor, pumping agents. One of the things I heard was, oh, it's only 94%. It's 94% water and sand, and everything else is some of those nasty chemicals you're talking about. It's very little. But when you're talking about 3, 5, 8 million gallons of fluid for fracking operation, you're talking about injecting this into the ground, and then you're talking about if you get 70%, which is what the industry used to say they get out of a well, 70% of that fluid, you're talking about 560 tractor-trailer loads of toxic waste that has to go somewhere. This is a photograph of a staging operation for a fracking. Those are all the chemical. I love some of the industry terms. These are called totes. Isn't that cute? Totes? Totes. Chemical totes. There's another fracking operation. Again, most of this is all happening just over the border in Pennsylvania. This is just after a fracking operation. All the blue trucks lined up there, those are the compressors. They're trying to reach upwards of 21,000 psi when they're pumping this stuff down into the ground. So they need multiple compressors to push this stuff down in the ground. There's another fracking operation. That looks, oops. So this is what we're talking about in the landscape. And again, linking this back to water. In New York City, your water is surface water. It's coming in to New York City's reservoirs and then being taken via tunnel into New York. And it's one of the cleanest unfiltered systems, and it's one of the largest unfiltered systems in the world. And across that landscape, it isn't just forests like that first picture. It's places where people live and have businesses and farms. But this is what's happening on the ground in those places. Again, these are pictures of Pennsylvania, but this could happen in the watershed. There's a compressor station. Infrastructure. With this whole process, you saw the photo of the pipeline. There's a whole series of infrastructure that needs to be built to carry the gas to market. So you have these compressor stations. These big turbines are out there. They're emitting all this stuff into the air. And these have to be certain distances across to take from the gathering lines and then put it into the pipeline. So you have access roads to every single one of these well paths. As you can see, here's an access road running right along the Shopping Creek in Gillingham, Pennsylvania. And then the next photo shows, what happens. You have an access road, and you look at the color of that water running in. That's one of the biggest fears for New York City. forget about the chemicals, all that stuff. All these access roads across the landscape would push New York City over into needing a filtration. They would lose their filtration avoidance determination, and they would have to filter their water because you get the turbidity in the water. Oh, here's a high-tech system for controlling that erosion. All of that runs into the water. Turbidity, what's turbidity? It's just stuff, little particles in the water. If you have little particles traveling in the water system, when New York City goes to chlorinate the water, if you've got this particle that has enough crevices in it for a bacteria to survive the shock of chlorine, then you have contaminated water. So that's why turbidity is the thing that allows them to not filter their water because it's clean enough. It doesn't have those little particles. So when they chlorinate it, the water is safe. If it becomes there's a little more dust in the water, then the chlorine won't work, and then you've got the potential pathogens passing into your water. One of the biggest issues with the whole gas industry is a 100-year history of non-disclosure agreements. This slide right here explains something that happened with the chemicals and the toxicity of the chemicals they're using. There was a spill on site. There were 40 cows grazing. 19 of them died. And what you see on this slide is basically all we know about this. Because they settled with the landowner, they paid for the cows, paid them something else, and had them sign a non-disclosure agreement. We're coming to an art gallery. I just love this picture. What do you worship?
Yeah.
So that first slide I was talking about the impacts on the landscape and the farms. This is just 1 month later, and already it's gone through a couple of different phases of gas drilling, and now there's another pad being built on the same farm. Well, in just 1 month. That's how fast this is happening. Again, now one of the things that's happening out in the western part of the state is one of the companies have different ways of operating. So now you have a well pad. It doesn't have the slurry pond right next to it. It has a centralized slurry pond that the water's getting piped in. And then they actually have another pad nearby to handle the chemicals. So much bigger operation. This is the impact on the landscape. Again, this is Dimmock, Pennsylvania. And what you have here is, here's the feeder pipeline running across the landscape. You've got the well pads that it's accessing, and the access roads. And one of the first things you see when you fly over this area, again in an airplane, is you see the well towers sticking up across the landscape, and as you come over that area, you see gravel banks everywhere. Makes total sense. They have to put in all these access roads where they get the material. And you can see these brand new gravel pits everywhere across the landscape. Again, impacting the water. So here's a photo of New York City's. This is the Patton Reservoir, and up in the other corner is the Cannonsville Reservoir. And I don't know if you can see it as well, but there's a gray shaded area. That's actually the watershed. What the brown blotches are on the map, this is an outdated map, by the way. This is way back in 2008. So there's a lot more land leased now. But this is leased land, and you do have the bulk of it outside the watershed. But here's an interesting thing. We went through this whole regulatory process in New York, and New York City hired Hazen and Sawyer, a engineering firm, to do comments on the regulatory process that we were doing on the supplemental generic environmental impact statement. And they had a little piece in there about impacts to the infrastructure. Now, if you look at this photo, you have right here about a 500-acre piece of leased land. All of these red marks on the landscape are natural fractures, natural faults that exist in the state of New York. That's one of the big issues with pushing this stuff into the ground and expecting it to stay down there. When we first started looking at this issue, everybody said, it's 8,000 feet down. All that nasty stuff stays down there. You don't need to worry about it. Well, that's forgetting about the 18,000 unplugged wells across the state of New York, and the guy that forgets to turn the valve off at the wrong time, the hoses that break, all that stuff. But just in terms of geology, I went to a geology seminar in Albany, and the New York State curator for oil and gas said, hey, you should look at the Utica shale because it's not as fractured as the Marcellus shale. In Texas, when they were trying to do hydraulic fracturing, they would hit these natural fractures, and they would put 8, 12, 14 million gallons of fluid and chemicals down there, and they could never get it up to pressure, which just means it's finding an exit, and they could never get it up to pressure. Well, these potentially what all of these red marks are equaling, and just so happens, that thing I pointed out, this mark right here, this blue line that's crossing here, that's New York City's water tunnel.
Wow.
So one of the last things I'm going to talk about, as I was starting Mountainkeeper, I ran a 150-member CSA organic vegetable farm. I ran it for years. We were starting Mountainkeeper. We had 200-year floods and a 500-year flood. I survived the 200-year flood. The 500-year flood took out 3 of my tractors, all my irrigation equipment, and 60% of my topsoil. So I made Mountainkeeper a full-time job instead of a part-time job. But in that process, and then gas drilling came along, one of the biggest concerns that people in our region had because of the flooding in the Catskills was putting all of that stuff that I just showed you on a floodplain. It's perfectly legal to put that stuff in a floodplain. So immediately, people were pushing for, we got to have this stuff in steel tanks or not in floodplains. So, again, that's that photo of the slurry pond. So New York State came out with their draft new regulations, and the press release said, no open pits. Everything's going to be in steel tanks or centralized containment facilities. I'm going to finish on centralized containment facilities. It's just a really big pit. So my last note is, one thing that's happened is this long history of the gas industry getting away with what they want all across the country. They haven't done that yet in New York State. They came here, we had this hold on the industry. We're going through a regulatory process they haven't started yet. It's up to everybody in this room and everybody else I've talked to over the last 2.5 years to totally change that. And we have an opportunity here that has not existed anywhere else in the country, and we can't blow it.